I always thought the worst thing about working alone at night was the silence. A silent Kanti explained the footsteps I heard when no one else was supposed to be there. Before I begin, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss future stories, leave a like, and drop a comment with your thoughts. Stay with me until the end, because the last part of these stories will shock you more than you expect. I used to work as a janitor at an old private school that had been around for nearly a century. It was one of those brick buildings, with winding staircases, endless corridors, and a basement that looked like something out of a horror movie. The staff usually left by 5 p.m., and by the time I started my shift at 7, the place was completely empty. At first, I liked the peace and quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the smell of floor cleaner, and the echo of my footsteps were almost comforting. But the basement, I dreaded it. The air was damp and heavy, and the pipes groaned like something alive. There were long rows of storage rooms down there, most of them filled with broken desks, boxes of old yearbooks, and random junk the school hadn't thrown away. One night, as I was finishing the classrooms upstairs, I noticed something strange on my checklist. It said the basement lights had been reported malfunctioning, and the principal had written a note asking me to check them out. That was odd because I never remembered the lights being a problem. They were old, yes, but they worked fine. Still, I had to do my job. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the creaky staircase. The moment I stepped into the basement, I felt that shift in the air, like walking into a place you don't belong. The main hallway was dimly lit, half the bulbs flickering weakly. I clicked on my flashlight and walked to the far end where the storage rooms were. As I passed the first room, I thought I heard something shuffle inside. I froze. My light swept across the doorway, and I told myself it was just a mouse. But then I noticed the door. It wasn't just cracked open, it was wide open. I could have sworn I locked it the night before. I called out a shaky hello. But of course, no answer. I took a step inside. The smell of mildew hit me first, mixed with something metallic, like rust. My light cut through the room, revealing stacks of boxers and a broken chair in the corner. Everything looked normal, except for one detail. A single, old-fashioned desk lamp sat in the middle of the floor, unplugged, but its bulb was glowing faintly. I froze in place, my throat dry. There were no outlets nearby, and the cord lay coiled beside it. Yet, the bulb flickered like it was alive. I backed out of the room slowly, never taking my eyes off the lamp. When I stepped back into the hallway, the rest of the basement lights suddenly went out, one by one, like someone was walking down the corridor flipping switches. Panic surged through me. My flashlight beam shook in my trembling hand. The silence was deafening until I heard it. Footsteps. Not shuffling, not random creaks. Clear, deliberate footsteps, echoing in the dark hallway. Combing closer. "Who's down here?" I demanded, trying to sound brave. My voice cracked. No answer, just the slow, steady sound of shoes against concrete, approaching from the far end. I lifted my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated the empty corridor. Nothing. Yet the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they sounded no more than 10 feet away. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the wall. "I'll call the police," I shouted. My own voice bounced off the walls and mocked me. Then, silence again. I dared to move the flashlight beam, and that's when I saw it. At the very end of the hallway, where the last bulb flickered weakly, there was a figure standing, completely still. It was tall, too tall to be anyone I worked with. Its body slightly bent as if its head nearly touched the ceiling. The outline was dark, featureless, but unmistakably human. My stomach dropped. I blinked and it was gone. The bulb at the end fizzled out, plunging the basement into complete darkness. I bolted up the stairs, my legs shaking so badly I nearly fell. I didn't stop until I was back on the main floor, lights blazing above me. When I finally calmed down enough to think, I realized something that made my skin crawl even more. The checklist I saw earlier, the note about the basement lights, I still had it in my pocket, and there was no writing about the lights on it at all. Someone, or something, wanted me down there. From that night on, I refused to work the basement alone. I told the principal the lights were fine and begged not to be sent down again. The school eventually closed off those storage rooms, claiming they were unsafe. But I know the truth, because even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I still hear those deliberate footsteps echoing in the dark. My second story comes from the time I worked night shifts at a community recreation center. It wasn't a bad job cleaning basketball courts, mopping the locker rooms, emptying trash cans. The building itself was massive, though, and when the last of the staff left around 9 p.m., I had the entire place to myself until morning. At first, I didn't mind. I liked to play music through my earbuds as I worked, just to break up the monotony. But I quickly learned that the gymnasium, the main basketball court, was the one place I never truly felt alone. The first time it happened was about 2 weeks into the job. I was sweeping the far side of the court when I heard it. The distinct sound of a basketball bouncing on the wood floor. I froze, broom in hand. The sound came from behind me, but when I turned around, the court was empty. I laughed nervously to myself, telling myself maybe the sound echoed from the neighborhood outside. Except the gym had no open windows, and the doors were locked. I shook it off. Kept sweeping. That's when the sound came again. One single, heavy bounce. Then another. The hairs on my neck stood up. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Silence. I left the broom on the floor and walked toward the noise, my sneakers squeaking against the polished wood. The entire court stretched out in front of me, lines painted for basketball and volleyball, bleachers folded up against the walls. Nothing looked out of place, but then I looked up. Hanging from the ceiling were the retractable basketball hoops. I could have sworn they'd been pulled up when I started, but now one of them was lowered, a ball sitting directly beneath it. I hadn't touched the hoop. I hadn't brought out a ball. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it. The bowl was an old leather one, scuffed and worn. Premeda picked it up, feeling its weight in my hands. For a second, I thought maybe a kid had forgotten it earlier in the day. I dribbled it once, just to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. The bounce echoed deep and hollow. I set it aside and went back to cleaning. But later that night, as I was emptying trash in the locker rooms, I heard the faint sound of squeaking sneakers, like someone running back and forth across the court. I stood there, frozen, the trash bag dangling from my hand. By the time I worked up the nerve to return to the gym, the noise had stopped. The bowl was gone. That became the routine for the next week. Every night, I'd hear something new in that gym: bouncing balls, footsteps, the echo of a whistle. Sometimes, I'd find the hoop lowered again, or the ball waiting in the center of the floor. One night, I decided I wasn't going to let it get to me. I came in, prepared, flashlight and all, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. Around midnight, the noises started again. A ball bouncing, sneakers squeaking, faint laughter echoing through the gym. My heart raced, but I forced myself forward. When I stepped inside, the lights overhead flickered once. 10 steadied. The court stretched out in front of me, empty, but the sound of a ball bouncing came from the far end. "All right, I know you're here," I shouted. "Come out!" The ball bounced again, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight and moved toward the sound. That's when I noticed the bleachers. One section had been pulled out, hoosed a little, enough to create a shadowed gap beneath them. I aimed my flashlight at the gap. 2 pale hands gripped the edge from underneath. Fingers long and thin, nails scraped down to the quick. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The hands disappeared in an instant, and the ball rolled slowly across the floor toward me. I bolted out of the gym, not even bothering to grab my cleaning cart. I hid in the staff lounge until morning, lights on, door locked. The next day, I told my supervisor what had happened. He looked at me strangely and asked if I'd heard the story about the basketball kid. Years ago, before I worked there, a teenage boy had been killed during a late-night practice. He'd collapsed on the court from a heart condition nobody knew he had. Some staff claimed his spirit lingered, restless, still trying to play. I didn't want to believe it. But the following week, as I worked, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. maybe exhaustion, maybe tricks of the building. That illusion shattered one final time. I was sweeping near the center of the court when the overhead lights began flickering wildly. I gripped the broom handle, staring up as the entire gym was plunged into strobe-like flashes. That's when I saw him. A boy, no older than 16, standing beneath the lowered hoop. His uniform was torn, his chest heaving like he'd just finished running sprints. Sweat dripped down his pale face, his eyes dark, hollow pits locked onto mine. He raised one hand and pointed directly at me. I dropped the broom and ran, my footsteps echoing against the wooden floor, the sound of a bowl bouncing right behind me with every stride. I quit the job the very next morning. I told them I couldn't work nights anymore, and when they asked why, I just said I'd found something better. But the truth is, even now, when I drive past that recreation center, I can almost hear it again. The squeak of sneakers, the deep echo of a ball bouncing in the empty dark, and Iknoe is still there, waiting for another game. My last story comes from the time I worked nights in a corporate office building downtown. Unlike the school or the rec center, this place wasn't old. It was modern with glass walls, automatic lights, and keycard security. You'd think that would make it safer. But in some ways, it was worse. I usually started my shift around 10 p.m. after the last employees left. The building had 10 floors, and I was responsible for floors 6 through 10. Most of the time, I never saw anyone, and the automatic lights would turn on as I entered each area. One night, as I was cleaning the 10th floor, I noticed something strange. The office lights in the far conference room were already on when I arrived. That shouldn't have been possible. The system always turned everything off after hours. I figured maybe someone had stayed late, so I walked down the long hallway, the sound of my cart's wheels squeaking against the polished tile. When I reached the glass doors of the conference room, I froze. The room was empty, but the light was on, and a chair sat pulled out at the head of the table. I stepped inside cautiously. Papers were scattered across the table, though I knew no one had been in earlier. A coffee cup sat in front of the chair, steam still faintly rising from it. I leaned in closer. The cup wasn't just warm, it was hot. Suddenly, the automatic lights in the hallway behind me shut off, leaving me in total silence except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. My reflection in the glass walls looked distorted, stretched unnaturally tall. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. That was just the beginning. Over the next week, every time I worked on the 10th floor, things happened that I couldn't explain. Computers would flicker on by themselves. Elevators would ding on the floor even though no one had swiped in. Once, I heard muffled voices coming from the offices, though every room I checked was empty. The strangest part was the security logs. To access the building, employees had to use key. One night, the guard at the front desk called me over and showed me something disturbing. At exactly 3:03 a.m., someone had swiped into the building. The system showed the name of a man who'd once worked there, but he hadn't been employed in over a decade. He had died in a car accident. I didn't want to believe it, but the guard swore it wasn't a glitch. He'd seen the elevator move on its own after the card registered. From that night on, I started paying attention to the time. Sure enough, a few nights later, as the clock ticked past 3 a.m., I heard the elevator ding on the 10th floor. My stomach dropped. The doors opened with a soft hiss. No one was inside. But when I looked down, I saw faint, wet footprints on the tile, leading out of the elevator and down the hall. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but against my better judgment, I followed the footprints. They glistened faintly under the fluorescent lights, leading all the way back to the same conference room. The door stood open. The chair was pulled out again. The papers rustled faintly, though the air was still. And then, clear as day, I heard it. A man's voice, low and tired, saying, "I'm not done." I dropped my supplies and sprinted for the stairwell. I didn't even wait for the elevator. I barreled down 10 flights of stairs, nearly twisting my ankle on the last set, and burst out into the lobby. The guard looked at me with wide eyes. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I couldn't answer. I just grabbed my bag and walked out into the night air, swearing I'd never go back. A week later, I quit. They offered me more money to stay, even better hours, But nothing could make me set foot in that building again after what I'd experienced. And the strangest part, a few months later, I read in the news that the company had shut down suddenly. Rumors said the upper floors were haunted. Employees had refused to stay past dark. I don't know if that's true, but I'll never forget the voice in that conference room, the voice of a man who should have been gone for years, still working long after death. Those were 3 real horror stories from janitors who worked alone at night. Places that should have been empty weren't. Footsteps echoed where no one stood, and some spirits never seemed to leave. If you've ever worked the night shift and experienced something unexplainable, share your story in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss more terrifying true stories. Because sometimes, the scariest things don't happen in abandoned houses or graveyards. They happen in the places we clean, the places we work, when we think we're all alone.